Because if we abandon Ukraine now, what signal does that send to the government of Taiwan or the people of Taiwan? What signal does that send to our allies in Europe? It look like America is not a trustworthy partner, and I don't think that serves America's long-term national interest, not just in Ukraine, but around the world.
We are now 162 days into Trump's presidency, and there's still no ceasefire agreement, and there's definitely no peace in Ukraine right now. How would you describe where the situation currently is in terms of US engagement in the peace process?
Tragic is the way I would describe it. As a candidate, President Trump said he was going to end this war in one day. He even said he would end it before his inauguration. Obviously, that was silly, but he signaled he was going to engage in the process aggressively. And I supported that, by the way. I applauded that. I don't get to applaud President Trump much, but I did on that. And then second, he took the difficult, but I think right decision to establish contacts with the Russians, open up dialogue with Minister Lavrov when Secretary of State Rubio met with him in Saudi Arabia. And then the special envoy, Steve Witkoff, met with Putin several times. And you have to do that as a necessary condition to mediate a negotiation. You have to talk to both sides. That was controversial here in the United States, but I supported that as well. But that's where my support ends, and tragically, where their efforts have ended. I just don't see any real energy right now from the Trump administration, from Secretary Rubio, from Mr. Witkoff, to try to mediate an end to this war. And on the contrary, it seems de facto that they're walking away. They're paying almost no attention whatsoever. And I think that leaves Ukraine worse off than they would have been had they tried nothing. Because in trying to negotiate, they made all sorts of concessions to the Russians and even hinted at even greater concessions. And they put all kinds of pressure on the government of Ukraine. And had that led to an outcome, an end to the war, maybe that would have been a cost worth paying. But that cost has been paid without any concrete results towards the end of the war. So I think we're in a pretty bad place right now.
We had the NATO summit last week, and Trump was uncharacteristically harsh about Putin, relatively for him, and had some good words for Ukraine and Europe in general. It sounds like you don't think that anything actually changed there, though.
Well, that's a good point you make, by the way, that at the NATO summit and a couple of times earlier, for the first time in over a decade, Donald Trump, either candidate or President Trump, was finally criticizing Putin. That's new. And we should note that. That is new. That's something that didn't happen before. He used to make all kinds of excuses for Putin. He was not doing that before. Secondly, sometimes you have to just celebrate the dogs that don't bark. The fact that they got through this NATO summit without some major spat between President Trump and one of the leaders. Remember, he's threatened to annex the territory of two of our allies, Canada and Denmark, and the fact that they did not have a major disruption and some threat of pulling out of NATO, that's a good sign for Ukraine too. We don't want a crisis within NATO at a time when Putin's Russia is threatening Europe to a much greater extent than you got to go deep into the Cold War to remember a time where the threat from Moscow was as great as it is today. So that's good news. But the bad news was that, the focus of the summit should have been the war in Ukraine, should have been what can the NATO alliance do to strengthen the armed forces of Ukraine, to strengthen the missile defenses of Ukraine from these barbaric civilian attacks that Putin has been waging against the innocent Ukrainian civilians, innocent Europeans. I want to emphasize that. This is part of a European theater of which NATO is a part. And because of the politics here in my country, because allegedly, according to reporting, President Trump didn't want to talk about Ukraine, Ukraine tragically did not have the prominent role at that summit that it should have had.
That's part of the sort of success of the NATO summit was you could tell that the leaders there, Mark Rutte, were going to great lengths to flatter him. Mark Rutte kind of infamously called him daddy, and he seemed to like that. The White House Twitter account made a video about it. Have we ever known a sort of global diplomatic situation where the flattery of one individual has been so crucial to like global events, or are we just in completely new territory here?
Definitely new territory in my reading of history and participating in history. And I just want to be clear, I don't like it. Do you think that they really believe what they say? No, they don't. They make fun of President Trump behind his back. Do they respect him? No, they don't. They don't respect him. This is what they think is necessary to get along with him. And just as an American, I find this humiliating. I want my country to be respected. I want my leader to be respected. And this is not that. I hope it's what is necessary to get through this tumultuous, dangerous period, because I believe that America is better off with strong allies that respect us. I believe we're better off engaging in the world rather than pulling back. I believe we're better off when we act in a multilateral setting with multilateral endorsements rather than in a unilateral way, as we just did when we bombed Iran. And I hope that strategy, it will still be available for the United States after the second term of President Trump. I don't know if it will. I want to be clear about that. Analytically, I don't know if it will be available, but I hope it will be. And I hope someday we get back to the old way of doing things.
Can you envision a scenario in the coming weeks or months where the US disengages from Ukraine completely?
Tragically, yes, I can imagine that. I find it disappointing that we're not even debating a new military package for Ukraine. Let's at least debate it and then let members of Congress vote where they want. Let's at least debate it so we know where President Trump stands on that issue. But it is just striking to me how this has become a secondary, if not tertiary issue now in American domestic politics. It's not even being discussed as an idea. And I think that means that the Trump administration is not planning to propose a new military package. And I don't see any initiative from either the Senate or the House of Representatives for that to be done too. And I just think that's not in America's national interest. Let's leave aside what's in Ukraine's national interest. Of course, Ukraine needs these weapon systems, particularly missile defenses, particularly a resupply of interceptors for those Patriot systems. But I think it's in America's national interest to do so, because if we abandon Ukraine now, what signal does that send to the government of Taiwan or the people of Taiwan? What signal does that send to our allies in Europe? It makes it look like America is not a trustworthy partner. And I don't think that serves America's long-term national interest, not just in Ukraine, but around the world.
For as little as $5 a month, you can support the Kyiv Independent. Our reporters are working hard every day to bring you reliable, independent journalism with a Ukraine perspective at the time when it matters the most.
And do you think there is any chance of Trump passing these additional sanctions on Russia? Or do you think he's going to maybe let the bill pass and then sort of let it wallow?
You know, that's a harder one because of the different things he said. He's gone back and forth. Obviously, Senator Lindsey Graham feels very passionate about this. That's a good sign as far as I'm concerned. And I just want to state the obvious from my point of view. What they're talking about in this bill should have been implemented 3.5 years ago. There's no reason why we're talking about these kinds of things now. When I look at missed opportunities, we could have put in a massive sanctions program back in 2022. And we could have done the same with regard to military assistance. This drip, drip, drip has not been, in my view, an effective strategy. And that goes for the years of the Biden administration. But better late than never, and most certainly better than lifting sanctions, as some people are talking about. And so I hope that it will go through. And this is one area where I wouldn't be surprised if Trump might support it.
If the US does disengage completely, how do you see things planning out, particularly in terms of Europe's role and what the future might hold over the next few months?
Well, I'd say two things. First, in my conversations with Ukrainians, which I do fairly often, I hear tiredness. I hear shock at how quickly America pivoted and abandonment. And I have friends who were hopeful when President Trump was elected. They thought this was going to be a new era in U.S.-Ukraine relations. I was not of that camp. I was not of that view. I understood their frustrations with the Biden administration. But most certainly those people are no longer optimistic about a new kind of intimate relationship with the United States. At the same time, I don't hear this idea of, well, now we have to quit. I hear exactly the opposite. As one of my Ukrainian colleagues said the other day, quoting Mike Tyson, and I'm just going to paraphrase here now, and I'm not going to name the member of parliament that said this, but he said, as Mike Tyson used to say, just because you're feeling tired, it doesn't mean that stop fighting is going to improve your situation. And that's most certainly the sentiment I hear, especially from colleagues in the Ukrainian government. Second, with respect to Europe, I do think this is an important moment in European history. I think the pledges of higher spending were important that came out of the NATO summit. I don't think that's because of Donald Trump. I think that's because of Vladimir Putin. But if it makes Trump feel better about it all, then give him credit. Obviously, this is about the threat from the East, the threat from Putin. And it's right to get on with these spending levels. The next step is further integration of, I would call it the European military-industrial complex. They can no longer just have 12 different kinds of platforms for various different weapon systems. That has to be a thing of the past. That is no longer, I think, a logical or prudent strategy for moving forward. And that debate is now happening. And then third, the integration of Ukrainian industries, Ukrainian drone companies with European, and I hope in the long run, American, to help advance the resupply of Ukraine. That, I think, also has to be part of this new agenda, tragically, if the United States is not going to be an active participant.
With respect to Europe, they're taking steps now to increase defense spending and increasing the size and power of their own armies. Is there any situation where you can envision a scenario where things in Ukraine get so bad that a European nation would potentially step in, or do you think that is absolutely off the cards?
That's a great question that among my colleagues here in the United States, we debate and we lament that we won't be a part of it. I don't know the answer to that question. I don't feel like I'm qualified enough to talk about the debates in European capitals. I think it's unlikely. I think instead there'll be some pressure for peace under bad terms for Ukraine. And I hope it doesn't come to that. I hope instead that the European capitals and NATO as a whole gives Ukraine what it needs to stop the Russian invading forces. This is a precarious moment in the war. Everybody realizes that. And therefore, I think it demands more creative ideas about how to better supply those incredibly courageous but also tired Ukrainian warriors that are stopping those Russian forces right now on the battlefront.
And how happy do you think Putin is right now with how things have panned out this year?
Publicly, he's a lot of bravado. We're still marching forward. I see little signs that he wants to negotiate. Tragically, I want to emphasize that. I wish that were not the case. Also tragically, I think he's committed to his original war aims. I've seen nothing that has changed his views on that. And at a minimum, trying to conquer, whether he succeeds or not, I don't know, but trying to conquer the Ukrainian territory that he on paper annexed a couple of years ago. I just don't see any scenario under which he stops fighting until he's either accomplished that goal or his armies cannot accomplish that goal. I just don't see him suing for peace before then. That said, this is catastrophic when we put it into larger terms and we think about how historians will write about this war a decade from now, I think it's a catastrophic loss for Russia. Remember what he said 3.5 years ago. At least I do. I listened to every word of that address very closely many times. He said Ukrainians and Russians are just the same nation. He just said that last week again. Ukrainians are just Russians with accents, and he's going to reunite the Slavic nation. Well, that didn't happen. The exact opposite has happened. The Ukrainian identity, you could tell me better than I, because you're in Ukraine now and I'm not, but it seems to me is stronger than it's ever been in its entire history. That's strike one against Putin's agenda. Number two, he thought his soldiers were going to be downtown Kyiv in a matter of weeks. They lost the Battle of Kyiv. They lost the Battle of Kharkiv. They got pushed out. And yes, there's been incremental gains this year, and those are tragic and scary from my point of view. But the idea that they are going to conquer all of Ukraine, that is not happening ever. Third, the Ukrainian army today is the most powerful and capable in all of Europe. That's as a result of Vladimir Putin's invasion. And that army will only get stronger over the years and decades. That's a problem for Mr. Putin. And fourth, he said this whole thing was about stopping the expansion of NATO. And yet by invading Ukraine, he brought in, no disrespect to some recent members from the Balkans that have joined, but he brought in two incredibly powerful new allies, Sweden and Finland. These are countries with real capabilities, and they're strengthening those capabilities. And finally, this war in many ways, in my view, is about Putin's fear of democracy, because he does not want to see a Slavic country practice democracy on his borders. And yet, despite all of the troubles, and there are real struggles with democratic institutions inside Ukraine because of this war, that is true, but there is not a military dictatorship in Ukraine. That is a tremendous achievement. And in the long run, democracy in Ukraine, coupled with a thriving capitalist economy, will be the greatest threat of all to Vladimir Putin's dictatorship. And if I had to predict, I think that outcome is much more likely today than it was before Putin invaded. So, in the short term, he has the short-term objectives he wants to remain committed to. But in the long term, I think he's already lost this war.
So the US hasn't disengaged yet, and a lot of our viewers are in the United States. Do you have any advice or any things that they can do if they want to help and to persuade people to get the US more engaged in Ukraine?
Yeah, it's a hard time right now here because we have so many of our own issues, scandals, challenges to democracy, wars. We just launched a bombing strike in Iran. And so the bandwidth for focusing on Ukraine is much more constrained here in the United States than it was before. That's just an analytic statement. That said, I'm also, when I look at opinion polls, the majority of Americans still support Ukraine. Maybe President Trump doesn't, but the majority of Americans do. And 81%. We don't have any polls that have 81% on anything, to the best of my knowledge, except this one poll. 81% of Americans don't like and don't trust Vladimir Putin. We have deep agreement about that gentleman, about that leader as being threatening to the world, threatening to Ukraine, threatening to Europe and the United States. So that creates a basis for remobilization. And what I would say to my fellow Americans is make sure your representatives in Congress know that you still care about Ukraine. It matters. I've seen it before on other issues. I've seen it on this issue when we were debating the last big aid package to Ukraine. Phone calls to your representatives matter because that's the way they judge whether their constituents care or not. So I would encourage everybody to make sure their members of Congress know that they still care about the fate of Ukraine. I most certainly do.
Thanks for watching. And if you enjoyed those insights from Ambassador McFaul, you can help us produce more videos like that by becoming a member. And you can do that by going to KyivinDependent.com/membership.